information so that he can use it to threaten you. So it's I mean, my goodness, if you don't,
what a contrast, right?
What a contrast. Just to recap, Yasser Qadi got in trouble, not for all the lies he told, but for telling the truth. We have video of him. Here's what I say to a popular audience. I lie to them and tell them perfect preservation. Behind the scenes, to other people who are becoming scholars, yes, there are all these textual variants and so on. What is he ultimately get in trouble for? Not for the lies, but for telling the truth. If it were a situation like this from one of our scholars or apologists, like William Lane Craig, if William Lane Craig got caught behind the scenes saying, I don't really believe any of this Kalam cosmological argument. It's all nonsense, and I just tell it to them because they're morons. He would be done. Not if he somehow acknowledged what he really believes or what he regards as the truth, but if in that situation, if he acknowledged that he was lying to people, he would be in trouble. So, my goodness, how's this dude comparing these two situations? The question is, what is it in Christianity and what is it in Islam that makes things this way? Because something is.
There is no great value placed on honesty and self-reflection and criticism. So.
All right, AP. So now you have the toughest part, because you have your Quran plagiarism point, and he's going to obliterate you. Ready?
From different cultures, from folk myths, or from different religions, such as, for example, Dhul-Qarnayn, a character found in the Quran that corresponds to Alexander the Great, and legends that people told about him.
So
is this guy for real? Did you really claim that Dhul-Qarnayn is similar to Alexander the Great?
Pause. Did I really do such a terrible thing?
Actually, he's got a point, although it's not the point he was making. The actual point is, no, we don't believe Dhul-Qarnayn is similar to the actual Alexander the Great. He is borderline identical. Dhul-Qarnayn is borderline identical to a mythical version of Alexander the Great that was found in what are called the Alexander romances that were circulating during the time of Muhammad. He is borderline identical to that.
Yeah.
And the only difference is he's like a devout Muslim. That's it.
It is not me who claims that Dhul-Qarnayn is similar to Alexander the Great.
Yes, it is. You're a liar. So you made it up.
It sounds like he's acting like he heard this for the first time, and he's like, "Wow, are you really saying Dhul-Qarnayn is similar to Alexander the Great? Wow, what in the world?
What a liar! What an atheist!
How ridiculous, guys! Listen to this. He is suggesting that Dhul-Qarnayn is similar to Alexander the Great. I mean, I don't even have to respond to this. Seriously, man? Do you think I am the one who's actually bringing this up?
Yeah, why'd you make that up?
This is an idea. This is the idea that Dhul-Qarnayn probably refers to Alexander the Great is an idea that was known among Islamic scholars within the first centuries, for a very long time, and even until recent centuries. Some people today even still believe that it is a reference to Alexander the Great, but that Alexander the Great's history has been corrupted, or that it is not entirely applicable, that there is something wrong. But this idea was presented by Muslim scholars themselves. It is only now, today, and sometime in the past, I think around the time of the supposed golden age of Islam, after the first few centuries, the idea emerged that Dhul-Qarnayn is probably not Alexander the Great, or is definitely not Alexander the Great, but somebody else instead. And then there are some options like Cyrus the Great, or different people that may be the actual Dhul-Qarnayn that the Quran is talking about. Here is the issue. Why did Muslims initially believe that this is about Alexander the Great? Why does the character Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran have so many differences with myths told about Alexander the Great? Just the name, it begins only with the name. Dhul-Qarnayn means the two-horned one. It refers to the guy being known as somebody who has two horns. This originates from a title given to Alexander the Great throughout the centuries in the regions. He was known as the two-horned one. There were coins, money going around, including money that reached Arabia, which had depictions of depictions representing Alexander the Great with two horns on his helmet or on his head, which is why he was famously known as the two-horned one. Then there are lots of parallels, that he had a huge kingdom or empire, that he had a huge realm, that he was given a lot of power. Alexander the Great was known, people fantasized about him and told his stories as this great, huge hero prior to the time of Islam and during the time of Islam, because of the vast empire that he built, and because of the vast power that he established over people. There are similarities of Dhul-Qarnayn and the Alexander romance, which are stories, tales written about Alexander the Great, which are not based on facts, but which are based on legends that people told each other about Alexander the Great. And those stories mention how Alexander the Great was, traveling, and he reached a people who were tribal people, nomadic people, or just basically primitive people, and they asked him for help, and they asked him to build a barrier between them and tribes that constantly plague and invade them, and he actually does try to help them. And these tribes are connected to Gog and Magog, which may have been a name, according to some historians, in the past to describe certain tribal nomadic people who would come from the north repeatedly and invade people's lands and steal their belongings and their wives and so on. So it's very funny. I mean, these are stories which you find in old stories, in old tales about Alexander the Great. And for some reason, you find in the Quran a character who has so much in common with that fictional version of Alexander the Great, and even his name is Dhul-Qarnayn. And it's also funny how this story comes into the Quran. It is people allegedly come to Muhammad and ask him about Dhul-Qarnayn, and he doesn't really know about the answer. So he disappears and comes back, and he tells them later about this guy Dhul-Qarnayn through the Quran, through Quranic revelations, who allegedly had great power and who traveled to the east and the west, and he saw the sun setting in a muddy spring, and he built a wall for these people, and one day those people will come out and invade the world, and those are Gog and Magog, and so on. So it looks like he heard about Dhul-Qarnayn. He didn't really know what to say. Then somebody told him about these stories, and then he included them as revelations in the Quran, which is why Muslims for centuries believed that Dhul-Qarnayn in the Quran is actually Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great was actually a righteous guy who was guided by Allah. And by the way, a quick note to add, Muslims were not the only ones who thought that Dhul-Qarnayn was a righteous guy. We have historical records of Jews over time, Jewish communities over time, adopting this whole idea that Alexander the Great may have been a righteous guy who was guided by God. This is not a fundamental Jewish belief, but a belief adopted among certain Jews and then spread among themselves because they had to somehow explain why God would give a man who is a completely wicked man such power over humanity. And they then thought to themselves, I guess he was a righteous guy. He was a righteous Gentile whom God guided, So it is no surprise that Muhammad comes along and adopts this sentiment from Jews or from other people, and then tells a fictionalized story about Alexander the Great and turns him into a guy guided by Allah. But the problem is, what do we know today about Alexander the Great and his beliefs and his lifestyle, David?
Yeah, that dude is about as pagan as you could possibly be. He had he worshipped Zeus and Hercules and everything, but he also had no problem when he went to various places of worshiping their gods and so on. So, and even accepted being a kind of deity. And so that dude is as pagan as you could possibly be. So to come along and, he's a devout Muslim, that's a problem. By the way, so do you remember the ISIS the ISIS recruiter from Australia who renounced Islam in prison. This is what he said,
Yeah.
because this dude, I've watched clips of this dude. This dude was like really, really smart. He's one of those people who can apparently pick up languages very quickly and like be almost perfect at them very quickly, because he just keeps picking up all these languages and so on. So anyway, he gets Aramaic down. And so this is from the article in the Atlantic, which talk about this. But this was one of his main reasons. This issue of Alexander the Great. So this is from an article in the Atlantic. This was an ISIS recruiter. It says, in prison, he began to study the Quran in greater detail and focused on the aspects that most puzzled him. Among these was the figure called Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who appears in the Quran's 18th chapter and is believed by many to refer to Alexander the Great. I thought AP was making that up. That's strange. Ser Antonio did not see Notice, here we have, Ser Antonio did not see a resemblance between Dhul Qarnayn and the Alexander of history, but he noticed similarities between Dhul Qarnayn and a heavily fabulized version of Alexander's story written in Aramaic. He considered that the Aramaic version may have plagiarized the Quran, but after acquiring a copy of the Aramaic and translating it for himself, he determined that the reverse was more likely. Realizing that Dhul Qarnayn was not at all a real person, but was rather based on a fictional account of Alexander the Great, instantly left me with only one possible conclusion. The Quran was not divinely inspired, he wrote. It had taken Alexander the Great fan fiction as fact.
This is a hardcore Islamist.
Okay, so you saw the crux of the argument. So, according to some historians and the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, Alexander the Great did worship the God of the Jews. See Josephus's Jewish Iniquities, chapter 11, section 317 to 345. It's possible that Alexander the Great later in his life left paganism and became a believer in God, and that is what the Quran is referring to. This can't be disproven, as historians aren't sure what Alexander the Great believed in. So I agree with David Wood that Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. I mean, nobody else in history was associated with the Gog and Magog story except Alexander the Great. So I agree with him that Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great, nobody else. Cyrus of Persia was never associated with the Gog and Magog story. It was only Alexander the Great. But historians don't know for sure what Alexander the Great believed in. It's possible he was a pagan, then later on he became a worshiper of the God of the Jews, and the Quran is praising him in the later part of his life. So, it's pretty much a done deal. Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. Nobody else was associated with the Gog and Magog, story except Alexander the Great. So it's Alexander the Great. I mean, there's no getting around this. But this doesn't pose a threat to the Quran, to the validity of the Quran, since according to Josephus, Alexander the Great did believe in the God of the Jews. So this is not a problem for the Quran. So the next point David Wood brings up is the Alexander romance. Now, the fact of the matter is the Alexander romance actually postdates the Quran, or came after the Quran. Especially, the story of Dhul Qarnayn building a wall against Gog and Magog. So it's impossible for the Quran to have copied or plagiarized off the Alexander romance. The first mention of the Gog and Magog wall by Alexander is in the Syriac version of the Alexander romance. That version comes from the 7th century, at least 80 to 100 years after the Quran was revealed, or about 95 years after the Quran was revealed. Now let's read a scholarly quote from a scholarly book regarding this issue, or the dating of the Gog and Magog story in the Alexander romance. The Syriac version of the Alexander romance, dates from the 7th century. The Quran was revealed in the late 5th and early 6th century. So the Syriac version of the Alexander romance came at least 80 to 100 years after the Quran chapter 18 was revealed. This is the important part. The episode of Alexander's building of a wall against Gog and Magog, however, is not found in the oldest Greek, Latin, Armenian, and Syriac versions of the Romance. So the earliest versions of the Alexander Romance did not have the building of the wall against Gog and Magog. So that means that the Quran was the first book to mention Alexander the Great building a wall against Gog and Magog. Then the Alexander Romance mentioned the building of the wall against Gog and Magog after the Quran. So the Quran's version came first, the Alexander Romance came second. Hang on one second. It says this text is a short appendix attached to the Syriac manuscripts of the Alexander Romance. So if you read further in this book, it says on page 16 and 17 that a Eastern Syrian Christian redactor added that Gog and Magog story into the Alexander Romance. So what that means is that a Christian living at least, 80 to 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad put that story into the Alexander Romance. So it's impossible for the Quran to have copied off the Alexander Romance when the Alexander Romance mentions the Gog and Magog story at least 80 to 95 years after the Quran chapter 18 was revealed, and at least 80 years after the Prophet Muhammad died, 80 to 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad died. So it's impossible, I repeat, it's impossible for the Quran to have copied this story, because this story in the Alexander Romance actually came after the Quran. It doesn't predate the Quran. So the Quran's version came first, and the Alexander Romance version came second. So what are the conclusions we can draw from this? We can confidently say that Alexander the Great is Dhul Qarnayn. There's no getting around this, but this doesn't pose a threat to Islam or the Quran, because Alexander the Great, according to some historians and Josephus, did worship the God of the Jews. So it's possible that that Alexander the Great started off as a pagan, and then later on he became a monotheist or a believer in God. That's certainly possible. That can't be disproven. So the Quran is not in error here. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Alexander did believe in the God of the Jews. According to another work of Josephus, he was the first. He does mention that Alexander the Great did build a wall against Gog and Magog. So the Quran is repeating a historical story about Alexander the Great, which could not have been known to the people of the Prophet Muhammad, since those people had no access to the writings of Josephus, since the writings of Josephus were completely lost by the 6th century. So it's kind of a miracle that the Quran mentions a story that was lost over time, a 1st century Jewish story that was lost over time, in an accurate representation of the Gog and Magog, of the wall against Gog and Magog. But anyways, the Alexander Romance postdates the Quran. It came after the Quran. Thus, the author of the Quran couldn't have copied off a document that came after the Quran or postdates the Quran by at least 80 to 70 years. So hopefully this refutes this refutes David Wood and Apuss's argument that the Quran copied off the Alexander Romance, when it's actually the other way around. The Alexander Romance probably copied off the Quran. So stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead.